Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. We are in the middle of a big-time game week here in Happy Valley, just a few days away from Penn State hosting Ohio State, number 3 versus number 4 in the nation, with a lot on the line. Penn State, of course, looking to snap a 7-game losing streak against the Buckeyes that spans back to 2016 when the Nittany Lions last won a game in this series and ultimately helped springboard them to a surprising Big Ten championship that year. If they do beat Ohio State, they will certainly be in the driver's seat for a spot in the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis. And who knows what could come out of that, perhaps even a first-round bye. We'll break down a lot about these Buckeyes in just a little while with Patrick Murphy, who covers Ohio State for our 24/7 Sports Network. Considering this was for so long a divisional matchup, no more divisions now, but we got Ohio State on the schedule. But there has been a reason to have Patrick Murphy on an annual basis. So those of you who have listened to this podcast for a while, he's the same 24/7 Sports Buckeyes insider that we've had before each one of these matchups for probably the last 4, 5, 6 seasons at this stage. So we'll tap into that. I know he had some press conferences in Columbus here today earlier, so we'll get some fresh intel from him. 6-1 are the Ohio State Buckeyes. They were down in the fourth quarter at home against Nebraska last week, looking at the potential for a second straight loss. They survived that scare. We'll talk about how they are in terms of strengths, weaknesses, and maybe question marks coming into Beaver Stadium on Saturday. But first, we begin with the recruiting spectacle that will take place in State College on Saturday. You've got a lot going on here on campus. You're going to have ESPN Game Day, Fox Big Noon Kickoff. As I said, Josh Pate, our close friend and national reporter here within the 24/7 Sports and CBS network, he's coming to town for his show. And so it is a huge scene, and naturally recruits are gravitating toward it. And to discuss that and the potential big positive boost that Penn State could take out of this one beyond the field, we bring in Tyler Calvaruso, our resident recruiting insider at Lions247.com. Tyler, good to have you back on board. And after a few weeks away from home field action where you weren't trying to assemble these lists, you are going hour by hour, minute by minute, it feels like, with the updates at Lions247.com this week. Really something special brewing for the Nittany Lions recruiting department.
Yeah, first things first, let me say I'm glad I don't have to lead in with my cliche of, not a lot going on in the recruiting front right now, but still plenty to talk about. No, there's a lot going on now. The best way to put it is like this. Normally, me and you, when we talk about these lists early in the week, we kind of harp on that caveat that this is where things are at now and check back later because it's going to be a lot bigger of a list. It is here Tuesday afternoon, and we're at 55 plus confirmations already on recruits visiting. That's commits, that's top targets, that's a flip target. So this weekend is shaping. It's a monster weekend, no doubt about it. You got the whiteout on the horizon that's expected to be even bigger, but this weekend is not short on high-quality names, high-quality visitors. So, yeah, we've got a ton to dive into here today.
Let's set the stage a little bit before we discuss some of those headliners on the confirmed guest list with you, Tyler. And that is the fact that clearly, and this is back-to-back weekends they're getting, but clearly this is a destination opportunity before the whiteout next week with Washington. We'll tease that a little bit later in the show. But when Ohio State comes to town, it's always a big deal. When both these teams are in the top 5, it's going to be a bigger deal. I think in terms of ramifications of the matchup on the field, perhaps there's a little bit less on the line because of the safety net that's now in place with the 12-team playoff. That's not to say Penn State doesn't want to break that losing streak and punch its ticket to the college football playoff in the most decisive way it could, but it feels a little less do or die for the Nittany Lions because of those circumstances. From a recruiting angle, what is at stake this Saturday, and what would a win mean for the Nittany Lions?
We usually stray away from quantifying it in terms of wins and losses because there's a lot more that goes into every kid's recruitment than the on-field result. A win won't necessarily gain you a commit. A loss won't necessarily net you a decommit. But this weekend, the stakes are definitely high, I think personally, for a couple of different reasons. Penn State, it's been a while since they've gotten over that hump with Ohio State. And recruits, they see the chatter on social media. As much as someone will tell you they tune it out, they focus on their own process, their own individual relationships with the staff, everything like that. They see the talk that Penn State hasn't beaten Ohio State in a while. James Franklin hasn't knocked off the Buckeyes in a while. Does that play some sort of influence? For some kids, it might. So if Penn State is able to beat Ohio State on Saturday, I do think that it would definitely pay dividends for the Nittany Lions in the long run. getting over that hump, knocking off an opponent that they've struggled with recently. And you also got to take into account the fact that there are many recruitments taking place right now as we speak where Penn State and Ohio State are duking it out. That applies to many of the kids who are making it to campus this weekend. Penn State's high on the list, Ohio State's high on the list. Now, again, head-to-head, it's never going to be the end-all, be-all in a kid's process. But if they can watch an Andy Kotelnicki offense go out and potentially out-scheme Ohio State, or a Tom Allen defense shut down that two-headed rushing attack Ohio State has out of the backfield, all of those talented wide receivers the Buckeyes have in their room, if they can see with their own eyes Tom Allen's defense shutting that group down, that can only work in Penn State's favor. So a win, again, it's not going to, solidify things necessarily in terms of getting a kid or losing a kid if Penn State takes a loss, but it's going to help. It's a big-time opportunity for the staff, and I think everyone inside of Lash is really well aware of that.
If you're a senior in high school right now, and a lot of the recruits we're going to talk about are actually juniors in high school right now in that 2026 class, but if you're a senior, you have to go back to elementary school the last time you were able to turn on a TV and watch Penn State beat Ohio State. And that's a significant span of time. And I think when you look at this, not only is it's twofold. Not only can you really help yourself out and get over that proverbial hump, reaching 8-0 in the driver's seat, as I said, to get to Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game. But when's the last time Ohio State, who you're always contending with on the recruiting trail, in some ways you're always chasing a little bit on the recruiting trail, when's the last time they had 2 losses in early November? I mean, that it could be a real, 1-2 kind of punch there for Penn State to help themselves and to hurt Ohio State. And there will be noise around the Buckeyes if they were to pick up a second loss in 3 matchups. And they were down in the fourth quarter against Nebraska in between those. So they've got to get there. They've got to get that result. But there is a lot on the line that they could gain and potentially take away from Ohio State over the course of this weekend in the eyes of recruits. And as we dive into these headline names, I wanted to let people know we've got 50% off going on right now at lines247.com all the way up through game day. So right now you can jump on board, get 50% off of our outrageously good coverage this week as we lead up to the recruiting matchup or to the recruiting spectacle and to this matchup itself. But you can stay on board for that 50% rate all the way through the remainder of this season, through the transfer portal periods, through National Signing Day, through basketball season, which we cover extremely closely, through the recruiting camps, through spring ball, into next preseason, and into next season, because you're getting a full year for half off our normal price. And I know I wanted to just put that out there because Tyler, you've been putting in some hard work on the recruiting trail. Brian Doan, our national recruiting analyst, continues to contribute a bunch of stuff over at the site. And we'll talk about one of his reports in just a moment. And meanwhile, myself, Daniel Gallen, and Mark Brennan will be at practice on Wednesday for Penn State. We'll get eyes on Drew Allard, Denai Dennis Sutton. We'll have questions for James Franklin. We're in the thick of it here when it comes to the game prep. So you're not going to miss a thing following Penn State football at lines247.com. And if you have not joined us already, 50% off gets you in the door right now. Tyler, let's get into those names and let's get to that report I referenced from Brian Doan here on Tuesday afternoon as we record. Andrew Olish is now on this guest list. He's been committed to Michigan for a while. He's one of the premier tight ends in America. Some would make the case that he is the top tight end in the country, and he is also a top 50 overall recruit. So what do we make of this opportunity?
Well, Penn State hasn't taken its foot off the gas with Olish. Getting him back to campus was always the goal. It's looking like that's going to happen on Saturday, which goes without saying it's crucial. There are only so many open dates to work with at this point in the year when it comes to flip targets taking visits. You've got postseason play starting across the nation. That complicates things. Olish, free Saturday, he's going to be at Penn State. And when you look at his recruitment and the way things are kind of starting to fall, Alabama was involved as a top contender to flip Olish right along with Penn State. The Tide went out and flipped another tight end. Oregon has been in the Olish was just at Oregon for a visit. Ducks have been in the mix to flip him pretty solidly right along with Bama and Penn State. They could be making some noise with another tight end target who's a little bit close to home. What does that do for their pursuit of Olish? We're going to have to wait and see. If that potential flip at least, comes together. We'll see what kind of impact that has on Olish's process. And then we've got Notre Dame in the mix now. Fighting Irish are going to get an official visit from Olish, and I think everyone listening knows Notre Dame's reputation getting tight ends to the next level, developing tight ends and having them succeed at the professional ranks. But hey, look, Penn State churning out some similar stars at the position. You're seeing Tyler Warren develop into one right before our own eyes. You also get a look at the future at the same time, seeing Luke Reynolds, former 5-star, on the field as often as he is. All of that has been pitched to Olich. That's been made quite clear to him. You can come here. You will have the chance to contribute early as long as you take care of everything you got to take care of, as is the case with every recruit that Penn State goes after. And there's a lot to sell on the development front right now. There's plenty to sell on the playing time front right now with Reynolds seeing the field early. James Franklin has been to Olish's school. It has been made crystal clear to him how much of a priority he is, how much he is wanted in State College. So I think that we are at a point where the early signing period is close to a month away. Olish getting back to campus, it's crucial for Penn State. It's a massive opportunity for the staff, and I think the staff has the potential to hit a home run with him this weekend. Especially if Tyler Warren has himself a day like he did against USC or anything really even mirroring that in that regard, that would be huge for Penn State. I don't expect Tyler Warren to do that again. That'd be a crazy expectation, but a strong performance from him, it can only help.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if it's fair to expect a
that's
catch effort, but he's been doing it all. And like you said, they have also been working in Luke Reynolds, 5-star freshman. Has he played a bunch? Has he seen a bunch of targets? Not necessarily, but he's played every game. And he actually started at Wisconsin. That was his third start. He's really been tight end 3 behind Warren and Dinkins. And then the other selling point is, for as awesome as Tyler Warren has been and now how much you want to showcase him, he'll be wearing an NFL uniform next year, and he has played a ton of snaps. He's played more than any non-QB at a skill position in this offense. So there are a lot of snaps that are going to need to be taken next year in 2025. And I know Olish is a guy trying to keep his focus on freshman options and freshman possibilities for playing time. He is the number 1 player in the state of Pennsylvania. We got a few other players here in the state to get to, and we'll look at the 2026 class because Olish, of course, coming down to the wire, a guy that's going to be signing with the program of his choice in December. So he is the priority for us to get to here. And then some other names we wanted to turn to, a couple in-state safety prospects who are highly ranked and highly offered. Joey O'Brien, top 100 recruit. Matt Sieg, a top 24/7 recruit. Kind of break down these separate recruits for us and talk about how Penn State has a chance to impress both.
O'Brien's that guy in Pennsylvania in the 26th class, top ranked prospect in the class in our rankings here, 24/7, top 100 kid. He's elite, man. If you throw on his tape, he's getting the job done on both sides of the ball. Penn State wants him badly. He was back on campus for the Illinois game in September, which was something of a surprise visit. Looked like he was going to be at Alabama that weekend, made it to Penn State instead. Now he's going to get back for another look at the Nittany Lions, and that's important considering the feedback coming out of that Illinois visit was O'Brien caught up with our guy, Brian Doan, and he told him, look, Penn State's always going to be high on my list. So getting another visit in here for Penn State is important with O'Brien. And O'Brien, recent game, he was rocking some Penn State gear. He was rocking the arm sleeve, rocking the gloves. So Nittany Lions making their impression throughout this fall in the top 100 prospect. And then with Sieg, who just –
Can we just say one more thing on O'Brien? I know we've mentioned it in the past when he's come up. I'm just going to do it again for our listeners who maybe don't have their finger on the pulse of recruiting all the time. Yeah. 2026 kid, top player in Pennsylvania, as you said, also from the same program that produced Abdul Carter, who's putting together an all-American-like kind of campaign for the Nittany Lions as a junior and is being projected as a top 10 draft pick. So keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, that stuff definitely matters because trust me, there's communication between those two sides. Everyone knows what Abdul Carter is and him being a LaSalle guy. It matters, trust me. And then with C, I just feel like he's poised to continue rising in the rankings. Our 24/7 sports team, Hudson Standish, he got eyes on Sieg's recent tape, then the updated evaluations we have on the site. Again, 50% off if you want to check that out. Really just the returns on his skill set and upside continue to be positive. Really what Penn State has seen in him from the start when it offered last fall. He's one of those names who's high on the safeties board for Anthony Poindexter. He got a look at Penn State last weekend. He was at Wisconsin. Badgers, by the way, got to say, they are a legitimate player in this recruitment. Do not want to discount Wisconsin's involvement. But it's going to be 3 weekends in a row seeing Penn State for Matt Sieg. He's going to be on campus Saturday. He's going to be back for the whiteout next weekend. So he's gotten plenty of exposure. And he also saw Penn State earlier in the season, the West Virginia game. He's gotten plenty of exposure to Penn State's defense under Tom Allen. He's gotten plenty of exposure to the staff through really a multitude of unofficial visits. I've said this plenty of times here. I still think things look really good here for the Nittany Lions. It could be a matter of, when Sieg decides he wants to wrap things up. The tea leaves read pretty heavily in Penn State's favor, but not done yet. And Nittany Lions hoping to keep this one moving in the right direction these next 2 weekends.
Yeah, Penn State obviously off to a strong start in state for that 2026 class. They got Kevin Brown on board. He's the top offensive lineman in the state of Pennsylvania. They got Messiah Mickens on board. He's the top running back in the state of Pennsylvania for that 2026 class. And currently that is a group that has 6 total commits on board. It's the number 5 class nationally. And remember, it's got a nice cross-country feel to it with a 4-star quarterback in Troy Hune out of California on board as well. Wanted to go out of state for a couple 2026 prospects of interest here for the conversation. Connor Salmon, a Virginia wide receiver who's inside the top 24/7, and another top 24/7 talent in Ohio running back Sean Alston.
Both prospects at Penn State pretty high on their list. Alston's a little bit further along in his process. He told me when I caught up with him to check and make sure he was visiting this weekend that he's kind of on the verge of cutting things down. Gut feeling, I would say Penn State survives that cut. They're pretty hot. They've done some good work with Alston. And Penn State has always wanted to pair another elite level running back prospect in this class along with Messiah Mickens. Alston's a guy who he fits that profile. You know, he tested well for the staff during the summer, performed well during whiteout camp. So there's a lot to like about him. He's going to be getting another look at Penn State on Saturday. And Salmon's another guy who just really wowed the staff during the summer with the way he tested. That kid can run. He's a really good route runner, has good hands, almost pretty much everything you want out of a high-level wide receiver prospect. That's a fight. We talked about recruitments that have Ohio State involved right along with Penn State. This is one of them. Notre Dame is pretty heavily involved, so ton of top-tier competition to land Connor Salmon. Penn State doing its part to stand out early, but again, this is one that's far from done, and Penn State is hoping to make another positive impression. We talked about Andy Kotelnicki's offense. Wide receiver utilization is something these guys keep a very close eye on when they make it to campus. Saturday, Salmon's going to get an in-game look at that for the first time.
Alston, by the way, I mentioned he's a big-time running back talent from Ohio. No Ohio State offer yet. He's number 110 overall in our national rankings. He's the number 9 running back, but the Buckeyes have not yet pulled the trigger. We've seen them slow play in-state recruits in the past. We've seen Penn State benefit from that with a couple guys who've signed with them in the past. But to this point, Alston has the Penn State offer, does not have the Ohio State offer. Let's finish on this list. And by the way, as you said, 50-plus confirmed names already at this stage of the week. That's a huge number. They're all over at Lions247.com. We're not going to break down 50 names here because we want to have a show that doesn't last 3.5 hours. But one more name we did want to get to for this guest list is Maxwell Hiller. And for this one, we're working our way to the 2027 class. So we're talking about high school sophomores, but he is truly one of the names to know, not just in the state of Pennsylvania, but really in the Northeast region, in Big Ten territory for the 2027 cycle. He's considered a top 25 overall talent, one of the premier offensive linemen in the country. He really wowed us on the camp circuit this summer, and he's getting back to town. I know Phil Troutwine loves that.
Yeah, I mean, he's worked his way up to composite 5-star status already, which is well-deserved. Max, he's a great kid to deal with, and he's a really, really good football player. He's a national recruit at this point. There's no doubt about it, and he's one of those top priorities in the 27 class for Phil Troutwine on the offensive line. He keeps getting back to campus. He's going to be back next weekend for the whiteout too. So, and I wrote this morning after sharing that he was going to be visiting. It's definitely not a bad sign that he's visiting twice in as many weekends. He's been around a bunch. He makes a point of getting back to Penn State. He's told me, hey, look, any chance that I get to return to campus for a visit, I'm going to take it. That's what he's doing this weekend.
He's from Coatesville, Pennsylvania. I'll put it out there. If you live in the area, I'd suggest maybe checking him out one Friday night because he is going to be a big-time player to know these next couple of years. What does the college football world think about him? Well, I mentioned what our ratings say, but Penn State has the company of schools like Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M in this pursuit. And as I said, he's a sophomore, so this is a big-time name. Tyler, let's turn our attention toward next Saturday. And on the field, we're never looking past Ohio State. But on the recruiting trail, we're going to look past this matchup just a bit because this is the first time I can really recall in my 8th season covering Penn State where they have back-to-back weekends that shape up like this. You've got Ohio State, a game everyone in the nation's paying attention to for a noon kickoff. And then next Saturday, we're waiting to hear whether it's going to be a 3:30 p.m. kickoff or a night game, but Washington will come to town. They were the runner-ups last year in the national championship game. Been a different story for them as a Big Ten newcomer, but it's a game that's going to have a lot of buzz around it, especially if Penn State's 8-0 going into that matchup. And you've already got a lot of confirmations coming through on that. I know you think it could prove to be a bigger guest list than what we're working with this time around. And part of that is because the time of day versus having to get recruits on campus on a Saturday morning. Give us a couple names just as a tease that we should be aware of for that whiteout list already.
Got another big one this morning. Top 100 corner Corey Adams out of Maryland. Got his offer from Penn State in June after working out with Terry Smith and the rest of Penn State's defensive staff. Traveled to State College specifically for that. Did not camp, did not take part, just an individual workout. He wanted that Penn State offer. Got it. And then he lines up there on his list. He was last on campus for Lash Bash at the end of July. That was a visit that went well. One that allowed him to learn just how much James Franklin wants him to be an Nittany Lion. So Penn State's been working to get him back to town. Going to happen next weekend for the whiteout. And then one of Ty Howell's top tight end targets in that 26 class, Kendra Harrison out of North Carolina. Penn State could swing in this weight class at tight end at this point. They 100% can. And Henderson, his recruitment is – it's interesting because there's a basketball element of it. And if you watch his highlights, he can legitimately play high major basketball if that's what he wants to do. So that's a part of it. But Penn State, they're taking their swing here. They're going to continue taking their swing. Next Saturday, it's a big opportunity.
Yeah, and by the way, I believe he averaged like a double-double, 20.
Yeah, he averaged like 20 and 10, which is
I think it was 20 and 15 as a freshman during a run to the state championship game. Did Kendra Harrison for Reedsville High School down there.
Harrison can ball.
And he has a who's who offer list as a junior. He's 6'7", 240 pounds, the kind of tight end prospect that you envision as maybe a plug and play talent for your offense as a true freshman on campus. He's number 17 in our rankings for the 2026 class and tops that list of tight ends. But like you said, Penn State is not going to be outclassed when it comes to this tight end department. The way it can sell it, the way it can point to success, that there is a lot working in their favor, and they'll get a swing with Harrison soon. Well, we'll have a full review of what lies ahead for the whiteout next week, and we'll talk about that with you on the podcast. We may have you pop up again on the podcast this week. We usually only have you on once during these game weeks, but maybe a little later on as we're previewing and predicting the game, maybe you'll jump back on and join us if there's some names that we got to get to before Saturday. If not, a ton of coverage over at Lions247.com. And we're going to finish away from the football recruiting conversation, jump into the basketball recruiting for just a minute here, because Penn State may be on the cusp of picking up its top remaining target in the class of 2025. We're going to get an announcement on Friday. What do we need to know, and what could the impact be for Mike Rhodes' Penn State squad?
Yeah, it's almost decision time for Caden Mingo, top 50 guard from New York. He's going to be announcing his commitment in a pretty unique way. He's going on Power 105.1 FM, and if you're from New York, you're from the tri-state area, you know that's the Breakfast Club time. He's going to be announcing between 5:30 in the morning to 10 in the morning, so pretty wide time slot.
You're on that one, Mr. Calvaruso. You're on coverage for that one.
I know. It's like signing day. It's coming a month early, waking up at that time. But no, he's a really, really talented guard. Penn State has prioritized him since offering in the spring. It's coming down to the Nittany Lions, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, and Georgia. Georgia made a pretty strong push getting Mingo on campus for an official visit earlier this month. The Dogs definitely helped themselves in that recruitment. From where things stand from the Penn State perspective, there's continued to be a sense of optimism. I haven't heard of anything concrete being done here yet, but I continue to hear optimism from the Penn State side. And this late in the game, that's always eye-opening. Those close to Mingo have done a pretty nice job keeping this one close to the vest as time has gone on, as we've gotten closer to that decision date. It's pretty quiet on that front, so I think they're really deep into that final thought process. But Penn State continues to feel good about where it's at. So this is going to be one we're going to track very closely leading up to Friday. It's not just football week, it's basketball week too.
Yeah, basketball trying to take advantage of an opportunity here, and that would be a big-time pickup, a top 50 guard out of New York. They've got a fringe top 100 prospect at the forward position and Mason Blackwood on board. The other commitment so far in the 2025 class is Justin Hauser, a big man from Malvern here in Pennsylvania. Appreciate the perspective, Tyler. Basketball, but especially football, and I encourage everyone to take advantage, if they have not yet, on this 50% off deal to see what exactly Tyler Calvaruso provides us from a recruiting standpoint on a daily basis over at Lions247.com. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, man.
This episode of the Lions 247 podcast continues with focus on Penn State's next opponent, and many have considered this the biggest opponent on the 2024 schedule since we first got a look at it. It's the Ohio State Buckeyes. It has been an annual matchup for Penn State as divisional foes here in the Big Ten. There are no more divisions, and yet Ohio State remains on that schedule this year. The Buckeyes come to town at 6-1, ranked 4th nationally. They are a 4-point favorite last we checked at Caesars Sportsbook. And of course, they have a 7-game win streak in this series. We're going to learn more about them right now with help from Patrick Murphy, who covers the Buckeyes for 24/7 Sports. As I mentioned earlier in the show, Patrick has joined us before each one of these matchups during the last several seasons. He's a great resource for perspective from Columbus, and we welcome you back on now. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I always look forward to doing these with our various people at 24/7 Sports. I think it's an awesome thing that we are able to do, but I always have fun, specifically with you, Tyler.
Oh, I bet you say that to all the Big Ten
people.
do
not. I promise.
Well, thank you. And I know I'll be returning the favor with you later this week on your podcast, so that'll be fun for us as well. Yep. But let's get into it. It's going to be a lot of Ohio State here because we have questions. And the first one would probably be expectations versus reality. There was so much conversation this offseason about the amount of financial investment put into this particular Ohio State roster. They brought in a Big Ten head coach as their offensive coordinator in Chip Kelly, who made the move from UCLA. And obviously, the returning standouts are pretty obvious on this roster. So at 6-1, coming off of a scare against Nebraska, talk us through how those expectations have matched reality thus far.
Well, I think that we'll be able to answer that question best at the end, right? And that's kind of the thing I've said to people since the Oregon loss a few weeks ago. And then, as you mentioned, Ohio State only beating Nebraska 21-17. And it's probably super unfortunate that Nebraska was coming off that beatdown against Indiana, because obviously everyone's going to compare it directly to that game. Ryan Day even cautioned before that, like, this, we're not going to get that same Nebraska team that just kind of laid down against Indiana. But look, I think the main thing is that everything is still there for Ohio State. They wanted to win the Big Ten, beat Michigan, which is obviously at the end of the season, win the Big Ten, and win a national championship, all goals that are still attainable. Now, I think if you are a pessimistic Buckeye fan, and let me tell you, there are a lot of those out there, and even maybe some of the realistic Buckeye fans, you can look at it and say these last 2 games don't look like a team that's winning a national championship. I would argue that you lost by 1 to the number one team in the country on the road in a hostile environment. People point back the Ryan Day's 2-7 record in top 5 games. So like it's a lot of depending on how you want to view it. And Saturday's game is going to give us a lot more perspective probably on both of these teams. But yeah, when the expectations are as high, when you kind of do the all-in situation in any sport, the NBA, when you compile talent that we've seen on these super teams, NFL teams have started to do it to some degree. And obviously now with the transfer portal, college football teams can sort of do it. And I think that it's always going to be hard to live up to expectations because the expectation is you win every game and you win every game convincingly. And that just doesn't always happen. Ohio State's dealing with a couple injuries in key positions. How does that change things? Things like that, where you're not changing your overall expectations, but you do have to be realistic. So I think the expectations are still there. They've made that clear that one loss, another close game doesn't change anything. They still believe they have one of, if not the most talented teams and can win a national championship. The odds makers out there still believe it. You talked about the odds for this game. I think Ohio State's also second favorite to win the national championship behind Georgia. So I would say there's certainly reasons to be concerned if you're a Buckeye fan from what you've seen the last 2 weeks, but there are also reasons why people expect that this team will still be able to do what it set out to do.
Ryan Day is 62-9 as Ohio State's head coach. He's 41-4 through 45 Big Ten matchups. And yet, when you follow the act that Urban Meyer put together in Columbus, people are going to find reasons to get concerned or wonder if you're the right fit, especially as they go this long without beating Michigan, 3 years. And I look at the last 3 regular seasons, Patrick, they picked up their second loss Thanksgiving weekend, right, against Michigan in that rivalry. What would it mean if they picked up their second loss on November 2nd in Beaver Stadium?
Well, it would certainly change some of those goals I just talked about. You're probably out of the Big Ten championship game consideration unless things go pretty haywire. So you probably cross that one off. or maybe you just cross your fingers and hope that things work out for you. Still probably in the college football playoff conversation, but you're coming at it from a very different point of view, likely as one of the teams in the first round, maybe even having to go on the road, depending on how other teams do, as opposed to hosting a team as like a 5 seed, for instance. So it certainly changes the calculus. Could you still win a national championship with 2 losses? Yes, we're going to see that in this era of college football with the new college football playoff and 12 teams getting in and all that. It does change how you view things, but I certainly think, and depending on how this game goes, if it's another close loss, that's a painful one, but at least you can say, well, we've lost to 2 top 5 teams on the road. Like, we think if we get to a neutral site game or things like that, we have an opportunity, or if we get another crack. But it would not be what Ohio State fans, players, coaches all thought this team would be coming into the season, having 2 losses. I think 1 loss is palatable. 2 losses certainly changes the conversation.
Let's go back to that October 12th trip to Oregon. Ohio State was a slight favorite from a betting perspective. It ended up being a 1-point victory for Oregon. As you mentioned, the Big Ten newcomer is now the number 1 team in the nation in the AP poll. And then they followed that up with a bye week. They had a bye week the same time Penn State had their midseason bye. And then they resurfaced at home against Nebraska. And as we talked about, that was a lot more narrow than folks expected. So what went wrong and I think for the game at Oregon that ultimately led to their demise and carry over against Nebraska? Is there anything that you're particularly alerted to? I don't know if raising a red flag is right, but do you have any kind of concerns that have lingered for Ohio State out of the bye week that you saw again last weekend in Columbus?
It's funny. I say, like, trying to manage expectations, but my expectations sort of have changed a little bit watching the last 2 games. Look, the Oregon game, I think ultimately you'd love to have won that game if you're Ohio State, but and they talked about this a week ago, maybe losing that game highlights some of the things that would have been swept under the rug, in terms of some of the pass defense. They gave up 2 really big plays, one for a touchdown, pass plays, one for a touchdown, one that set up a touchdown. Okay, what is going wrong there that maybe we were able to avoid through those first 5 games and Oregon was able to exploit? The pass rush was not effective against Oregon. They did not make Dylan Gabriel uncomfortable. They did not sack him once. Even though PFF had it at a 40% pressure rate, it just didn't feel that way. So that was a topic of conversation during the bye week. Offensively, I think the Buckeyes felt pretty good coming out of that, other than the fact that you lose Josh Simmons, your left tackle, to a season-ending knee injury. So now you have to figure out that spot. And then you come into Nebraska that off weekend. And for some reason, Tyler, no one can seem to put a finger on this, but Ohio State has been pretty poor coming out of these bye weeks. And not necessarily that they lose, but just the games haven't been like you would expect for a team with 2 weeks to prepare. And it really felt like that again. The offense was kind of stuck in the mud. Zen Mikowski, who replaced Josh Simmons at left tackle, was getting beat frequently. And then he got hurt in the 4th quarter as well. And I would be surprised if he plays against Penn State, though Ryan Day left the door open for that. But I was on the sidelines and watched him not even walk by. He was being helped and seemed to be in a lot of pain. So you have that issue. You're not able to run the ball against Nebraska the way you were against other teams because of the offensive line issues. Defensively, the numbers are a lot better, but Nebraska doesn't test you the same way that Oregon did or that Penn State will. Indiana down the line, a freshman quarterback in Dilla Raiola, who I think will be really good. But at one point, he missed a wide open receiver after a cornerback fell down. Some other missed opportunities there. So the numbers look better. You did get more pressure on the quarterback. They did start to do some more things with some blitzes. As simple as this may sound, stunts and twists with the defensive line, which they weren't doing. So that there were positives to see them try some new things defensively. But I won't know if they've made strides really until this weekend's game and how they handle things against Penn State. It's just tough to get a read on what Nebraska was really able to do and how much of that was Nebraska or how much of that was Ohio State.
Something else that's probably tough to get a read on this week is which quarterback they're going to be dealing with for the Ohio State defense. Because here we're wondering that question. We're going to get a look at practice on Wednesday. We'll see if Drew Aller is out there working through drills as normally running around, or if he's limited or not there at all. But he didn't finish the game at Wisconsin. We saw a full second half of Bo Prabula, who was really impressive, completed 85% of his passes, tossed a touchdown, led 2 lengthy scoring drives, didn't turn the ball over in a situation that could have gone off the rails for Penn State. And the big thing here is that I know Ryan Day during his press conference today, which I read through some of the transcript you guys put up on your site before we had you on. And yeah, he did his best to kind of say these quarterbacks both do similar things. They can run, they can throw. We all know Drew Aller is an improved athlete this year. He shed some baby weight. He's moving around the pocket better. But Bo Prabula is one of the best athletes on this team. And they've known he would be that kind of player since they recruited him out of high school. He's the kind of guy who could have played a few positions at this level of college football. So with that in mind, what do you think is the big challenge this week for that Ohio State defense? And they're going to see both guys. I know that. If Drew Aller's available, it doesn't mean Bo Prabula is going to be standing on the sideline. But just because they don't quite know who's going to take that first snap Saturday at noon, what does that present to them?
Certainly makes it more challenging. And I do think, as you just mentioned, it is a little bit easier because you're probably going to prepare at least some for both quarterbacks anyway. And that was probably part of the calculus coming in. But yeah, not having an idea, and Jim Knowles was asked about this as well, defensive coordinator. You basically have to have 2 different game plans for whoever is in the game or whoever starts, whatever the situation may be. And look, any time not spent on doing one thing means you're not going to be as good as that one thing, right? And, that's an advantage. I think you hear all the time, well, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have one. I think Penn State's in a really good spot where they certainly have one in Drew Aller and then a backup who they are very confident in to come in and do some things. And so I think it stresses the opposing defense before they even get on the field because of the amount of time you have to dedicate to something maybe you wouldn't in another week. I assume that they will focus more on the Drew Aller type stuff, but Ohio State's also struggled against mobile quarterbacks. I mean, even Dylan Raiola, who came into the game last week, having rushed for negative 49 rushing yards, hit a couple plays, including a big one on Ohio State. So the discipline to try and keep a mobile quarterback in the pocket will be big this week. But yeah, it's certainly a disadvantage to not know what's going to happen from an Ohio State perspective, but these things happen throughout the season. You got to be ready for them.
Let's talk about Ohio State's quarterback situation. We've seen big performances in this series for Buckeyes wins from JT Barrett, Dwayne Haskins, CJ Stroud over the years. Last year, Kyle McCord and this Ohio State offense, with some help from the Penn State defense, really left the door open for Penn State in Columbus last year. Offensively, they just couldn't get much accomplished last year as they fired their offensive coordinator before it was all said and done. But now it's Will Howard. Kyle McCord's off, and he's now with Syracuse. Will Howard is the guy who came in via transfer. What have you seen from him thus far? I know a lot of people were fixated on him sliding to end the game in Eugene for that loss against Oregon. But big picture, 7-game sample size, where is Will Howard directing this offense with Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator and distributing the ball with efficiency?
Will Howard's been really good. I just to put it simply, when he became a target in the transfer portal after Ohio State finished the 2023 season and played in the Cotton Bowl, I was a bit concerned, I guess I would say, just watching back some of his Kansas State games and things like that. Like, certainly a guy who can move around. He can run. Kansas State would use him to run quite a bit, but wasn't always the most accurate, had some really bad turnovers, things like that. But he's cleaned a lot of that stuff up. I think it certainly helps playing with a receiving core that he's got in Columbus, the running backs that are around him. He's even talked about that and making sure to say no slight to the guys he played with at Kansas State. But it's certainly been different. And at first, especially in spring practice, I think that was a bit of a struggle trying to get up to speed with the speed of these guys when you're trying to throw the ball to them. But throughout this season, he's been good. Very few of those, boneheaded mistakes he made at Kansas State. He has thrown some interceptions, but none that have been backbreaking, though he did throw one at Nebraska last week that almost led to a touchdown, and that could have made things a little bit more interesting. So he probably has a mistake or two in him, though he was very clean against Oregon. But completing a high percentage of his passes. The downfield throw, the deep shots have been a topic of conversation. Well, he hit 2 of them last week against Nebraska to kind of get the Ohio State offense going. So he gives them that dual threat ability, the veteran leadership that they probably didn't have last year with the first-year starter in Kyle McCord. And, he's played in these big games before. I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, the slide against Oregon. But other than that, he did have one drop snap in the third quarter when Ohio State was driving that ended a drive on third down. That, in retrospect, if you're able to continue that drive, you might score a touchdown, go up 2 scores. But for the most part, he was very good in a hostile environment, kept things on schedule and whatnot. So I don't think will be rattled by what he's walking into. In fact, he commented after the game. I'm sure people saw this comment. He was asked about going back to Pennsylvania to play and talked about how he grew up a Penn State fan, and then finished it with, "They didn't think I was good enough, but I guess we'll see next week if I was." And then he just walked out of the room. So, taking a little bit of a shot there, and he is he's proven to be pretty confident. And I think in a rivalry, I know this isn't the rivalry for either of these teams, but I think it's a series that has become rival adjacent. Maybe having some of that is fun back and forth, I think.
Not to mention, we got former Mr. Ohio football, Drew Aller, as the potential starting quarterback, at least for Penn State. And by the way, I think the popular response on our message board to the comments from Will Howard about that was, well, dude, Ohio State didn't want you out of high school either. And,
right.
But things happen, you develop, and all of a sudden the transfer market brews for you. And he was a big name out there. 74% completion this year. That's up from 61% last season with Kansas State. He's got 22 total touchdowns, including 5 rushing versus 4 interceptions. Look, that wide receiver room for Ohio State for years now has been kind of a revolving doors of 5-star recruits on their way to becoming first-round NFL draft picks. I know, speaking with Julian Fleming at a couple different points this year since he made the move to Happy Valley, just what he learned and picked up from being a part of that room and that competition on a daily basis was big. So to see a true freshman, I don't care how he was rated. I know he was rated more highly than just about any receiver recruit we've seen, but Jeremiah Smith has a touchdown in his first 7 college football games. He's got 600+ receiving yards, 8 touchdowns total during a 6-1 start. And he has a catch of at least 45 yards in 5 of 7 matchups. I can't believe I'm overshadowing Emeka Egbuka and Carnell Tate, 2 guys that were also considered all-world coming to Columbus and have done good things. But what in the heck has Jeremiah Smith been able to accomplish here during his first campaign at the college level?
Yeah, he's already tied the Ohio State freshman receiving touchdown record with the numbers that you just talked about there. He did it in just over half a season. So, look, I knew this kid was good when Ohio State was recruiting him. I'd seen some clips. I'd talked to people who had watched him play in person. But for me, it was always like, well, yeah, but Garrett Wilson and Marvin Harrison and these guys that had come in, and almost all of them took until at least kind of the second half of their freshman year to really become a factor in the offense. And just as we kept going throughout the offseason, seeing Jeremiah Smith in spring practice and some of the stuff that the Buckeyes were doing with him, became more and more apparent that this was going to be a guy who's going to be a starter day one, which just hasn't happened in Brian Hartline's receiving room very often. And he's lived up to all of the hype thus far. He is, the one-handed catches he has made. I know those were making the rounds a few weeks ago. Just the even the routine plays. Last week against Nebraska, he gets wide open for a deep touchdown pass. But it's his movement off the line, the quick little stutter stuff. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that if the rules were different, this kid could have gone straight to the NFL and been an NFL wide receiver straight out of high school. He's got the physical tools, and that's something that's held back some of those other wide receivers I've mentioned. So he can hold up, he can do some of the blocking things they want, and then just naturally gifted. He comes from a family of athletes. Geno Smith, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback, is his cousin. So, obviously there's some good genetics there. The work ethic and not buying into the hype, which may be the biggest thing. And Chip Kelly talked about that when we spoke with him today, is that, it'd be very easy for a guy who's getting all of this recognition so early in his career to really start to buy into it and not put in the work, but he's continued to do that. And I guess when you were the top overall recruit and you've been talked about so long in high school, you're a little used to some of that, but it's certainly on a different level now. And yeah, I mean, I think even the people who had the highest of expectations for him probably are still being blown away a little bit by what he's been able to do.
It was a remarkable recruitment. I know it had some twists and turns. Ohio State ends up being the beneficiary when it's all said and done. But like you said, top overall recruit in 24/7 Sports Assessment for the last cycle, and really considered one of the all-time top prospects to come out of South Florida, which is really crazy because there's been a lot of them. But he's living up to the expectations, and Penn State certainly is going to spend a lot of this week game planning for how to limit that and maybe produce his worst game at the college level thus far. In the backfield, we've seen both of the primary running backs involved in different ways against Penn State. Travion Henderson's been involved in recent matchups in the Big Ten here. He's at 7.2 yards per carry with 4 touchdowns on the season, about 450 rushing yards. And then Quinshon Judkins, last time we saw him, he was running for over 100 yards in the Peach Bowl during Ole Miss's victory over Penn State. I think less than 2 weeks later, not only was he in the portal, but he was already on his way to Columbus. That happened fast. He leads Ohio State with 520 rushing yards, 6.5 yards per carry, 6 touchdowns on the season. So what can we expect on Saturday? This is a Penn State run defense that has been pretty strong. I think they've only given up 100-plus rushing yards twice in the last 16 or 17 Big Ten matchups overall. What will they be dealing with from this tandem?
It's a dangerous two-headed attack. And you mentioned Quinshon committing to Ohio State out of the transfer portal. He did it minutes after Michigan had won the national championship game. And I do not believe that that was a coincidence. At least that's when he put it out on social media. Maybe that was Ohio State saying, let's just hold off to announcing that one. But what's been really cool to see between two guys who have had a lot of success in college football in Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins is the camaraderie, the willingness, and obviously Penn State fans know what it's like to have two running backs who are willing to maybe take a lesser load in order for the betterment of the team. But these are two guys who, Quinshon Judkins could have transferred to anywhere in the country and been a star. He could have stayed at Ole Miss and continued to be a star, but he came and he's willing to share the backfield. Travion Henderson, same thing. He knew he was going to come back to Ohio State and didn't mind having his workload decreased a little bit by having another guy like that in there. And it's been a good use of both guys. There's been a good balance. There was conversation throughout the offseason, like, how do you get these guys enough touches? And the offense, Chip Kelly, Carlos Lachlan, the new running backs coach, have done a really good job. They both can do a little bit of everything. So I think you don't mind if one guy has to come out, putting the other guy in. Quinshon's probably a little bit better in the short yardage stuff, down by the end zone, those type of things. But Travion's hit, you mentioned the numbers there on his yards per carry, hit a couple more big plays. So both guys can do a little bit of each of that. It's been a nice little compliment to have. Now, I will say, last week against Nebraska, I mentioned the offensive line struggles. That led to, as a team, Ohio State rushing for only 64 rushing yards, but Quinshon Judkins had 29 on 10 carries and Travion Henderson 25 on 10 carries. So it was not a good performance. And that was a little bit of a hangover from Oregon, where they ran the ball better, but a couple big plays kind of covered up. Travion Henderson had, I think, like a 60-yard run at one point, kind of covered up what was not a great yards per carry day for either guy. So something to keep an eye on there, because as you mentioned, the numbers are good, but if the offensive line isn't creating holes and there are some issues there and Ohio State can't get that running game going, I think it's going to be a struggle to then try and just throw the ball throughout the game. That has not been what this Ohio State offense has been this year. It's been much more balanced.
Judkins went for 106 in the Peach Bowl on more than 30 carries. It was a busy day for him. And then Travion Henderson, this will be his 4th time as an Ohio State Buckeye going up against the Penn State squad. You go back to his freshman year for the best performance. And really, when you look at his freshman year collectively, that was his best season to this point. That year, October 30th of 2021, he went for 152 yards against Penn State in Columbus. So a little history here for both backs, and Penn State's defenders are well aware of that. I spoke with defensive captain Kobe King today. A lot of respect for those two, but they feel like they are getting their head around maybe what they need to do to wrap them up and keep them limited on Saturday. Before we get to our final predictions and what I want to hear from you there, I want to go to the defense. We're going to shortchange it a bit in this conversation because so much talk on the offense. But when we look at that side of the ball, what do you think are the strengths and maybe the potential weaknesses thus far for this Ohio State defense? And who in particular do you think could be a momentum swinger, a game wrecker potentially? Because we've seen that happen in Beaver Stadium from an Ohio State defender before as well.
Yeah. I will just refrain from talking about that specific player so as not to create nightmares for your listeners. Strengths and weaknesses. I think coming into the season, we were pretty confident about the secondary, and I still think the secondary is good. As I mentioned, Oregon hit a couple big plays on Denzel Burke specifically in that game. I think Denzel Burke really did clean some things up last week. He did give up a 30-yard catch that was then ruled an incomplete after review. It was one play. The rest of the plays he handled pretty well. I think he only gave up 2 catches for 6 yards. So at least statistically, it was a bounce back performance after a rough, really first half against Oregon. Davis Igbinosun is the one that the cornerback that most teams have picked on. Not a great cover corner. He's a very physical player. Ohio State has often played him a little bit off because he can get handsy. And last week against Nebraska, he got called for 3 pass interferences, 2 in 4 plays, and they pulled him out of the game for a couple plays there to just kind of calm him down. Defensive coordinator Jim Knowles said this week that he's going to have gloves on his hands so he can't grab as much, which is not something I've heard of as a tactic for that. But if that's the way they think that can help. So those are your 2 primary corners. The safeties, if Lathan Ransom is back, he did not play against Nebraska. He is a veteran. Last week, they kind of used a few different guys to cover up that spot. And then Caleb Downs, the transfer from Alabama, who has been, without the statistical numbers that he had at the Crimson Tide, where he led the team in tackles as a freshman, he's been very good. They can use him all over the field. I mentioned in our written piece I did with you, he could be a guy that they try and scheme up against Tyler Warren to try and neutralize him as much as possible. Not the biggest guy, but he'll bring the power in terms of hitting guys and whatnot. So I will be interested to see kind of where they use Caleb Downs. And then the defensive line, like this needs to be a thing. This needs to be the best game Ohio State's defensive line has played. They need to figure out ways to get pressure on the quarterback. They also have to be able to contain more mobile quarterbacks. For me, that's going to be key because they've been good enough in some of the lesser games, but against Oregon, like I said, no sacks. Last week against Nebraska, better, but it required them to bring more pressure. So I think those will kind of be the keys. If you're looking for a weakness, I still question some of the linebacker play, especially in coverage. I think Ohio State can be exposed there. It's gotten better throughout the season, but still kind of an area where the 2 linebackers that they predominantly use aren't the best in coverage, especially in zone coverage. Teams have been able to kind of find gaps in zones over the middle of the field, and that's where the linebackers tend to be.
Let's finish here. It's still relatively early in the week, and there are some questions about injuries on both sides. As you mentioned, the offensive tackle position for Ohio State, the quarterback spot here for Penn State. But what do you think as you look forward and try to forecast this one for Saturday afternoon? I'm going to preface this by saying it's Tuesday afternoon. You reserve the right to change your prediction on your site. But what do you have for us in terms of how this one ultimately ends?
Yeah, leaving that Nebraska game on Saturday, not trying to be too reactionary to what we just saw and whatnot. I was like, I think they lose next week at Penn State. And, I think some of that is Ohio State's struggles, specifically that offensive line. I'm not sure they have the guys to replace a guy like Josh Simmons successfully in the biggest games. Watching the tape back of last week's game and then watching Penn State go to Wisconsin and win without Drew Aller for the second half, nothing has changed my mind. I think it's going to be a tight game. It wouldn't surprise me if it's something like 24-17, 20-17, something like that. I think these are still 2 of the best teams in the country, but I think probably with some of the issues Ohio State's dealing with and maybe not the answers that they have to fix that, and I'm specifically talking about the injuries, it just may be too much going on the road and trying to get another one there. Wouldn't surprise me if I'm wrong here, but that's kind of the way I'm leaning here early in the week.
Appreciate it. Really good stuff from you, as always, on the Ohio State Buckeyes within the 24/7 Sports Network at Bucknuts. You do a great job. We'll do the best we can to give you some Penn State insight on your podcast later this week, and we'll see you in the press box Saturday. Patrick Murphy, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Tyler.
Good stuff from Patrick, as always. Before him, you heard from our recruiting insider, Tyler Calvaruso, breaking down the recruiting angle of what Saturday afternoon means for the Nittany Lions. We are back with our third episode this week on Thursday. We'll let you know what we saw, what we heard from the Penn State practice field during our weekly look. It should be a nice opportunity for us to give you some updates regarding those injuries, at least in terms of involvement and participation. And then we'll get into our predictions for this matchup. Is Penn State set to snap a 7-game losing streak against Ohio State? We got a couple more days. We'll give you our predictions, and we'll be getting close to kickoff here in Happy Valley. For now, stepping aside and reminding everyone that they can get 50% off Lions247.com VIP subscription right now and throughout the week. I'm Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.